by golly.
You're the man.
I'm scared as hell.
You're the man.
Hold me. I need you to hold me.
No, I won't be holding you.
I'm pretty nervous.
Let me
Thanks.
Don't leave me. Those were the last 3 words Chris Farley ever spoke. He was lying on the floor of his Chicago apartment, his body broken by addiction, his spirit shattered by fame. The person he was begging to stay was a woman he had paid for her company. She didn't stay. She took pictures of him, stole his watch, and walked out, leaving him to die alone. But this wasn't just a random overdose. This was the final, chilling scene of a life that had been meticulously, deliberately planned from the very beginning. Chris Farley wasn't just a victim of Hollywood excess. He was a man following a blueprint for self-destruction, written by his idol, John Belushi. And what happened in his final moments reveals a truth more horrifying than any comedy sketch he ever performed. To understand Chris Farley's death, you have to understand the ghost he was chasing. John Belushi was the original SNL wild man, a force of nature whose chaotic energy and drug-fueled antics defined a generation of comedy. But in 1982, that chaos consumed him. He was found dead of a drug overdose at the Chateau Marmont in Los Angeles. He was 33 years old. A sex worker was present. This tragedy wasn't a warning to Chris Farley. It was a roadmap. He saw Belushi's lifestyle not as a danger, but as a prerequisite for greatness. And he was determined to follow it step by fatal step, all the way to the same bitter end. Long before he ever set foot on the SNL stage, Farley was building his armor. As an overweight child in Wisconsin, he was a target. Other children mercilessly teased him, but he discovered a powerful weapon: humor. If he could make them laugh, they wouldn't hurt him. If he could be the clown, he could be accepted. This need to perform for approval became the engine of his life. It's what drove him to the second city in Chicago, where his raw, physical genius was impossible to ignore. He threw his entire body into every performance, a sweaty, chaotic tornado of energy. He was waiting for one man to notice, Lorne Michaels. And in 1990, that tap on the shoulder came. The nobody from Wisconsin was going to New York to become a star. His ascent was meteoric. Characters like Matt Foley, the hyper-caffeinated motivational speaker, became instant classics. In the very first sketch, he shocked everyone by diving through the air and crashing onto a coffee table. The reactions from David Spade and Christina Applegate were real. They had no idea he was going to do it. The audience went wild. That was Farley's magic. He was a live wire, unpredictable, and utterly compelling. He found his tribe in the bad boys of SNL: Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, David Spade. Their off-screen lives were a mirror of the on-screen. Chaos, prank calls, exposed backsides, and legendary parties. But for Farley, the party wasn't just fun. It was research. He was studying for the role of a lifetime, the doomed comic genius. The first major crack appeared during a party in a 15th-floor hotel room. Drunk and out of control, Farley almost fell through a window. Instead, he ended up in the emergency room with a gash running from his wrist to his elbow. That injury introduced him to prescription painkillers. It was the moment his addiction shifted from recreation to dependency. The physical pain was temporary, but the psychological need for a chemical escape had taken root, and it would never let him go, even as his star rose with films like Tommy Boy. The pressure was tearing him apart. The constant commute between SNL and the movie set in Toronto pushed him to the edge. One night, when David Spade went out without him, Farley's reaction was terrifyingly violent. He found Spade on set the next day, walked over to him, and stomped directly on his hand. It erupted into an all-out brawl. This wasn't just a prank. This was the rage and fear of a man who was losing control. He was trying to stay clean for the film, but his substitute was just as extreme, up to 27 cappuccinos a day. He was literally trying to power his addiction with caffeine. A desperate and futile attempt to keep the demons at bay. The system that created him soon turned on him. In 1995, NBC fired both him and Adam Sandler. The bad boys had become too much of a liability. He was humiliated, cast out from the show that made him. But Hollywood wasn't done with him yet. He set his sights on a new script, a dark comedy called The Cable Guy. He saw it as his chance to prove he was more than just a slapstick clown. But then Jim Carrey entered the picture. Carrey, the new king of comedy, wanted the role. The studio chose Carrey, paying him a record-breaking $20 million. Farley was left with Black Sheep, a pale imitation of Tommy Boy. The message was clear. He was replaceable. The betrayal cut deeper than any professional rejection. It confirmed his deepest fear that he wasn't a real artist. This resentment poisoned everything. On the set of Black Sheep, he saw the film as a dead end. He resented David Spade for being his co-star. The friendship that seemed unbreakable began to fracture. In a move that stunned everyone, Farley offered to pay Spade not to be in the movie. But the final blow to their friendship was personal. Spade had introduced Farley to a woman he liked, Lori Bagley. Farley and Bagley began a secret relationship behind Spade's back. When Spade found out, it was more than a betrayal. It was a deep, personal wound from his best friend. The one person who had always had his back was now another source of pain. The spiral accelerated. After a screening of Black Sheep, Farley broke his 6 months of sobriety. One drink led to another, and he was soon back in rehab. This began a horrific cycle. Over his final 2 years, he would check into 17 different treatment centers, rehab for drugs, clinics for weight loss, AA meetings. He was crying out for help, but the system had no cure for a man who believed his pain was the source of his power. The most chilling part of this story is how conscious his self-destruction was. He openly admitted that he started using drugs because he thought it was what made John Belushi funny. He was literally copying his idol's fatal habit. The resemblance was so acute that Bill Murray, a close friend of Belushi's, reportedly hated Farley. He couldn't stand to watch the same tragedy play out again, frame for frame. In the end, even his final opportunity was taken from him. He was cast as the voice of Shrek. He recorded hours of dialogue, bringing his unique bluster to the ogre. But the producers were so worried about his addictions, they assigned a minder to follow him, to keep him sober. He didn't live to finish the role. Mike Myers replaced him, and the character became an icon, another legacy stolen by his demons. His final night was a perfect, terrible echo of Belushi's. After a period of being clean, he fell off the wagon hard. He paid a woman for company. In his final, vulnerable moments, she didn't see a star. She saw a mark. She stole from him, photographed him in his pathetic state, and ignored his last, desperate plea. "Don't leave me." She left. And Chris Farley died as he lived, performing for someone who was only there for the money. At his funeral, the SNL family gathered, but one chair was conspicuously empty. David Spade couldn't bring himself to go. The friendship that defined an era had been destroyed by the very chaos that made them famous. Chris Farley's story is the ultimate cautionary tale. He didn't just die like his idol. He succeeded in becoming him. He followed the blueprint so perfectly that he ensured he would never live long, enough to step out of Belushi's shadow and become his own man. He believed the chaos was the cost of admission for genius. But in the end, the only thing it bought him was a ticket to an early grave, and the tragic legacy of a man who got exactly what he thought he wanted. The fame that Chris Farley had so desperately craved became a cage of expectation. After the explosive success of Tommy Boy, the public didn't just want him to be funny. They demanded he be Chris Farley, the 300-pound whirlwind of destruction who would dive through tables for a laugh. Studio executives saw him not as an actor, but as a franchise. They handed him scripts that were carbon copies of his past hits, each one featuring a lovable, clumsy oaf. Behind the scenes, Farley was terrified. He confided in friends that he felt trapped in this persona. He saw what happened to John Belushi, how he became a prisoner of his own Animal House wild man image, and he was watching it happen to himself in real time. The very thing that made him unique was now suffocating him. He began to believe, with a sinking certainty, that if he ever changed, if he ever lost weight or got sober, the magic would vanish and the world would abandon him. Amid the roaring laughter of audiences and the chaos of after parties, Farley was profoundly alone. His relationships were transactional, built on his ability to provide drugs, money, or a good time. He was surrounded by enablers, hangers-on who would never say no to the star. In moments of clarity, he would call his older brother, Kevin, his voice trembling with fear. "I don't know how to be alone," he confessed. The silence of his own apartment was a terrifying void that he filled with noise, people, and substances. The clown who could make millions laugh was, in his private life, a man staring into an abyss. Terrified of the quiet, this deep-seated loneliness made him cling to destructive relationships and pushed him further into the only comfort he knew, the numbing embrace of addiction. The rift with David Spade was the most painful wound of his career. What began as a legendary comedy partnership, a modern-day Laurel and Hardy, curdled into resentment and bitterness. The incident with Lori Bagley was the final straw, but the cracks had been forming for years. Spade's wiry, sarcastic wit was a perfect foil for Farley's physical chaos, but off-screen, their dynamic was strained. Spade was more cautious, more career-minded. He grew weary of the chaos that followed Farley everywhere. He started distancing himself, refusing to go out partying, making excuses. To Farley, who valued loyalty above all else, this felt like the ultimate betrayal. The offer to pay Spade to leave Black Sheep wasn't just a career move. It was the anguished cry of a man who felt abandoned by his best friend. He was firing him before he could be fired. Jim Carrey's ascension to Hollywood's highest-paid actor cast a long, dark shadow over Farley. While Farley was making Black Sheep for less than $1 million, Carrey was banking $20 million for The Cable Guy. This wasn't just a financial disparity. It was a brutal public valuation of their talent. In Farley's mind, Carrey was everything he wasn't: disciplined, bankable, and taken seriously. The trade papers celebrated Carrey's gamble on a dark role, while they pigeonholed Farley as a one-trick pony. The injustice of it festered within him. He started to see Carrey not as a peer, but as a rival who had stolen his destiny. This perceived theft fueled his insecurities and became a constant, toxic narrative in his head, one he would rant about during drug-fueled lows. The number 17 is a testament to both. Farley's desperate desire to live and the utter failure of the system to save him. Each trip to rehab followed the same heartbreaking pattern. A near-death scare or an intervention from his family would spark a moment of clarity. He would check in, full of remorse and determination. For a few weeks or months, he would be the model patient, clean, contrite, and planning his comeback. But the underlying issues were never addressed. His pathological fear of being unfunny, his deep self-loathing, and his belief in the Belushi myth. Upon release, the pressure to perform would return instantly. A bad review, a stressful meeting, or the silence of his apartment would send him spiraling. The cycle was a carousel of hell, and he was trapped on it, each revolution spinning faster than the last. The animosity from Bill Murray wasn't mere jealousy. It was a visceral, painful reaction to watching a ghost walk. Murray had been there in 1982 when they found John Belushi's body. He had seen the aftermath, the grief, the senseless waste. When he looked at Chris Farley, he didn't see a talented comedian. He saw a reckless kid playing with a loaded gun, mimicking the very behavior that killed his friend. Murray reportedly went out of his way to avoid Farley, and on the few occasions their paths crossed, he was cold and dismissive. He wasn't being cruel. He was trying to shut down a pattern he recognized as fatal. It was a warning from a survivor to a future victim, a warning that Farley, in his devotion to his idol, tragically misinterpreted. As a challenge, the recording booth for Shrek was supposed to be his sanctuary, a chance to create a lasting legacy without the physical toll of his live-action roles. For a while, it worked. His initial takes were brilliant. He infused the ogre with a blustering, vulnerable, and uniquely Farley-esque rage. But the producers at DreamWorks grew nervous. They heard the tremors in his voice, saw the sweat on his brow. The rumors of his drug use were rampant. In a move that crushed Farley's spirit, they assigned a production assistant to be his minder, to escort him to the sessions and ensure he was sober. This vote of no confidence shattered him. He was being treated like a child, a liability. The sessions became strained, and the magic began to fade. This final humiliation, this stripping away of his professional dignity, may have been the last straw that sent him careening back into his final, fatal binge. His return to host Saturday Night Live in October 1997 was billed as a triumph, a redemption story. The cold open featured Tim Meadows as a reporter interviewing Lorne Michaels, who proudly declared that Farley's parting days were over. The audience roared with approval, but for those who knew him, the performance was terrifying. He was thinner, his energy was manic and desperate, and his eyes held a haunted look. He was performing the role of sober Chris Farley, and it was a strained, unconvincing act. Backstage, he was a bundle of nerves, terrified of failing in the place that made him. That episode wasn't a celebration. It was a farewell. He was saying goodbye to the only home he'd ever known in the business, and everyone was too busy cheering to hear the goodbye in his voice. The weeks after the SNL appearance were a rapid, uncontrolled descent. The pressure of the comeback had been too much. He was clean for the show, but the moment it was over, the dam broke. He isolated himself in his $3,000 a month Chicago apartment, a messy shrine to his loneliness, filled with pizza boxes and empty bottles. He was surrounded by the ghosts of his Midwestern past, but utterly alone. He began to binge, mixing cocaine, morphine, and alcohol in a deadly cocktail. He was no longer partying. He was conducting a slow-motion suicide. The people who might have saved him his real friends from SNL were thousands of miles away. Having grown weary of the endless cycle of crisis and recovery, he was in free fall and there was no one left to catch him. The woman who was with him on his final night was not a friend or a lover. She was a 26-year-old escort named Heidi Hauser. She represented the absolute bottom of his loneliness. He wasn't seeking pleasure. He was paying for company, for a human presence to distract him from the void. As the drugs took hold, he became incoherent and vulnerable. That's when Hauser, seeing an opportunity, allegedly stole his watch. She then took out a camera and began photographing the comatose star, creating grotesque souvenirs of his final moments. When he mumbled those last, pathetic words, "Don't leave me," she ignored him. She gathered her things, stepped over the body of one of the most famous comedians in America, and walked out the door. Her final act was to call a friend to brag about what she had done, only learning of his death from the news the next day. It was his younger brother, John, who found him. He had grown worried after not hearing from Chris for 2 days. He used his key to enter the apartment on the 60th floor of the John Hancock Center. The scene he discovered would haunt him forever. Chris was lying on the floor, surrounded by drug paraphernalia. The official cause of death was a speedballa, lethal combination of cocaine and morphine. The Cook County Medical Examiner's report was a cold, clinical inventory of a body that had simply given up. He was 33 years old, the same age as John Belushi. The blueprint was complete. The funeral at Our Lady Queen of Peace Catholic Church in Madison, Wisconsin, was a somber affair. The comedy world turned out in force. Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, Tim Meadows, and Lorne Michaels all paid their respects. Sandler would later immortalize his friend in a heartbreaking song. But the focus wasn't on who was there. It was on who wasn't. David Spade's absence was a silent, screaming testament to their fractured bond. Spade later claimed it was too painful, that he couldn't face it. But to the outside world, it looked like the final act of a friendship that addiction had utterly destroyed. The parallels were now undeniable, and the media pounced on them. To SNL legends, to bad boys, to massive talents consumed by drugs. Both dead at 33. Both found in their homes after a night of parting with a woman who was not their wife. Farley hadn't just been inspired by Belushi. He had, in a tragic and terrifying way, merged with him. He had proven that the path was repeatable, that the system of fame and self-destruction was a machine that could crush anyone who followed its rules. This is the question that haunts everyone who knew him. The truth is, Chris Farley was surrounded by people who tried to save him. His family staged numerous interventions. His friends pleaded with him. He had access to the best rehab money could buy, but he was fighting an enemy more powerful than any intervention: his own belief system. He was convinced that his pain was his power, that his weight and his chaos were integral to his genius. In the end, he didn't want to be saved from addiction if it meant being saved from himself. He chose the myth over the man, and the price was everything. In the years following his death, Chris Farley didn't just become a memory. He became a ghost haunting the halls of Saturday Night Live for a new generation of cast members. His story was a mandatory cautionary tale. Veterans would point to his old dressing room, sharing stories of his genius and his downfall in the same breath. His shadow was particularly long for performers like Will Ferrell and Zach Galifianakis, who also used their physicality for comedy. They saw in Farley's story the terrifying price of that path. His legacy became a double-edged sword. He was the benchmark for fearless, all-in commitment, but he was also the warning sign that screamed go nitrogen monoxide further. He was both an inspiration and a terrifying specter of what could happen if you lost control. When Chris Farley died, he didn't just take himself with him. He took a library of unrealized potential. The most famous, of course, was Shrek, the handful of recordings that survive show a completely different ogre, less cynical, more blustering and vulnerable, a character steeped in Farley's own childlike pain. But that was just the beginning. He was in talks to star in a biographical film about the comedian Fatty Arbuckle, a role that would have been his Truman Show, a chance to merge his physicality with profound tragedy. There were discussions about a Matt Foley movie. Each of these lost projects is a ghost ship, a glimpse of an alternate universe where Chris Farley evolved beyond the cage of his own persona. His filmography is not just what he made, but a heartbreaking museum of what could have been. Farley's death, coming just 5 years after the overdose of his friend and SNL colleague, Phil Hartman, sent a seismic shock through the comedy world. The bad boy era of SNL effectively ended. The culture of enabling and looking the other way was replaced by a new, if fragile, sense of responsibility. Networks and studios began implementing stricter wellness checks and offering psychological support. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a direct response to the public and painful deaths of their biggest stars. Comedians started talking more openly about the link between comedy and pain, about the pressure to be on all the time. In a terrible, tragic way, Chris Farley's death may have saved lives by forcing an industry to look in the mirror it had been avoiding for decades. For the Farley family, the loss was not a public story. It was a private, unending ache. His father, Thomas Farley Sr., became a vocal advocate against substance abuse, channeling his grief into a mission to prevent other families from suffering the same fate. He spoke of the phone call from John, the one that told him his son was gone, as the moment his own world ended. The family had to endure not only the loss but the grotesque spectacle of his final moments being dissected in the media, the stolen watch, the photographs, the escort's cold testimony. All of it was a second ongoing trauma. Their memory of the funny, loving son and brother was forever entangled with the horrifying public details of his death. In the years that followed, the survivors of that era began to tell their stories, and Chris Farley was a central, tragic figure in all of them. David Spade, in his memoirs, wrote with a mix of affection, regret, and brutal honesty about their fractured friendship. He described the impossible position of being both a friend and an enabler, and the guilt that haunted him long after Farley was gone. Bob Odenkirk, who co-wrote the iconic Matt Foley sketch, spoke of Farley's deep intelligence and fear, revealing that the chaos was a carefully constructed performance masking a man who was far more thoughtful and insecure than anyone knew. These accounts pieced together a posthumous portrait of a man everyone knew, but no one truly understood. The greatest what if of all revolves around the cable guy. What if Jim Carrey had never shown interest? What if the studio had trusted Farley with that dark, unconventional role? Those who knew him believe it could have been a turning point. It would have given him the artistic validation he so desperately craved. proving he was more than just a slapstick actor. It might have given him the confidence to break the cycle, to see a future for himself beyond the fat guy falling down roles. Instead, losing it to Carrie confirmed his worst fears and sent him spiraling back to the safety and the prison of what he knew would sell. That single decision by a studio executive didn't just change the course of a movie. It may have sealed the fate of a man. The most haunting aspect of Chris Farley's story is that he predicted his own, and with uncanny accuracy. In a little-known interview early in his career, he was asked about John Belushi. He didn't just praise him. He laid out his own epitaph. He lived hard and he died hard, Farley said, almost in awe. It wasn't a warning he was giving. It was a goal. He saw Belushi's life as a complete arc, a perfect story of glorious, self-destructive genius in his mind. To die any other way, old, sober, and forgotten, would be a failure. His entire life was a conscious effort to live up to the legend of his idol. And in the end, he succeeded with a precision that is both breathtaking and utterly devastating. To write off Chris Farley's death as a tragic accident is to miss the point entirely. It was the culmination of a series of deliberate choices. He chose Belushi as his model. He chose to believe that his pain was his power. He chose to push away the people who tried to save him. He chose the drug that night. His death was not a random overdose. It was the final, logical conclusion of a philosophy he had embraced his entire adult life. He was not a passive victim of addiction. He was an active participant in his own destruction, a willing student in a school with only one graduate. Years later, the most poignant tribute came from his old friend, Adam Sandler. On stage, with just a guitar, Sandler sings the Chris Farley song. It's not a polished eulogy. It's a raw, funny, and heartbreaking stream of memories. He sings about the good times, the laughter, the madness, and then his voice cracks as he reaches is the end. He was a one-man party, a one-man show, and I miss my friend Chris Farley in that moment. The legend fades away, and all that's left is the simple, aching loss of a friend. It reminds us that behind the headlines, the scandals, and the shocking final moments, there was just a man, a kind, troubled, incredibly funny man who was loved and who is deeply missed. So, what are we left with? The image of a sweaty, laughing man crashing through a coffee table, or the image of a lonely man dying on a cold floor? The truth is, we are left with both. Chris Farley's life forces us to confront a difficult question about our own complicity. We, the audience, loved the chaos. We cheered for the table dives. We celebrated the bad boy persona. We wanted him to be Matt Foley, forever living in a van down by the river. We never stopped to ask if the man inside the character was okay. In the end, Chris Farley gave us exactly what we wanted. He poured every last ounce of himself onto the stage until there was nothing left. He died for our entertainment. And that is the most tragic punchline of all. His laughter echoed in millions of homes, but the silence he left behind speaks volumes. If this deep dive into the tragic story of Chris Farley made you feel something, whether it was joy, sadness, or shock, hit the like button and let us know your favorite Farley memory in the comments below. His story is a stark reminder of the human cost behind the comedy we love. Subscribe to the channel and tap the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the untold truths behind the icons who shaped our world. We want to hear from you. What do you think was the true tragedy of Chris Farley? Was it the addiction, the broken friendships, or the unrealized potential? And who should we cover next for Silver Screen Shadows? This has been Chris Farley, The Deliberate Tragedy. Thank you for watching. Remember the laughter, but never forget the man behind it.